Welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
Welcome once again to the Pompey Politics Podcast. If you're joining us live on Sunday evening, hopefully you're having a good time of it, or if you're catching up on a podcast provider, then hopefully our voices are coming through nice and warm as you settle down to enjoy another hour of politics. And what a week it's been. We did our special on Wednesday evening for the budget and various musings and machinations on that. A bit more's come out since. And of course, yesterday, Kemi Badenoch was announced as the new leader of the Conservative Party. I think to most people's surprise, but we're going to put that one on the shelf as we cross the pond to talk about our friends and comrades and colleagues in the good old US of A, Simon.
Yes, indeed. And because we both know even less about that than we do UK and Portsmouth politics, we've invited someone that does know about American politics and American history, and that is Lee Sartain, who's a senior lecturer in American history. So welcome to the show, Lee.
Hello. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. Thanks for giving up your part of your Sunday evening to help us poor Brits understand what the mess is across the other side of the pond. So hopefully we can make sense of it in the next hour. So I guess the best place for us to start would be if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and tell our viewers and listeners what it is about American history and politics that interests you.
Sure. I teach at the University of Portsmouth in the history department, also the politics department. Anything to do with US history, anything to do with US politics, they tend to wheel me in to try to explain it. I think most of us have contact with American politics, American history through the news, through films. So we all feel in some way we know America, I think. But when I first, I guess, fell in love with American history and politics was at university when they didn't run one of the courses that I wanted to do, I don't know, on the Regency or something British or European. And I thought, well, I'll just take that American module then, see, because somebody said it was quite a good module. And I thought, how have I missed this before? This is like the crack cocaine of politics. It's just astounding. Everything is louder, more exaggerated. In the 19th century, usually ends in violence in some way. It's like the Roman Empire in the kind of modern era. And on top of that, sometimes it's extremely funny as well. It doesn't make any sense. It's a very complicated system. You think it would be straightforward because they have a constitution, but they're constantly saying, well, that doesn't mean what you think it means. It means this other thing. So it's a very complicated way of looking at the world, being an American. At the same time, what I like about American history and politics is we don't just talk about what's happening. We quite often kind of delve back to what JFK did or what's happening in the civil rights movement, or go back to the First World War, or we might even go back to the Founding Fathers. It's something that Americans really engage with their history. They might get it wrong on occasions. I don't know if there's any Americans listening to this today, but sometimes they're quite fundamentalist about their history, if I can put it that way. Whilst other people say, well, actually, just because we did that in the 18th century, we shouldn't be doing it now. So it's, in some ways, it's a very prescient, immediate history that they put into their politics all the time. Donald Trump is always saying, you know, he's the best president ever, except for, was it Lincoln? So even he, that doesn't seem to know much history, is always delving into kind of key parts. So I find that fascinating. So we always have to talk about history, politics, culture, film, music. So I might talk about 1960s to my students, then we'll talk about Bob Dylan, or we'll talk about Nina Simone and Black Power music. It's always, it's very complicated to try to understand what they're doing. It is 360, 70 million people after all. That's a very full answer. Sorry, I went off on one there.
Yeah, that was no, it's fine. Very, very comprehensive. Thank you.
I guess,
Thank you very much.
we'll bounce about a little bit on our journey this evening, and you know, because as you say, it is complex. It is quite different, and sometimes quite challenging for us from the outside looking in to understand. So if we look at the current campaign, it seems to be so much more about personalities rather than policies.
Yes.
Is this something new? Is this the way kind of politics has always played out in America? Kind of what's your view on what we're seeing at the moment
Um,
in terms of the clips that we get here over in the UK?
I think American politics has always been very focused on personalities, but it is very much the system that they have embedded that comes from their constitution. So it's created a two-party system, which isn't just binary, it's kind of bipolar. Um, everything is exaggerated at most times. Um, and the presidency itself kind of does lend itself to kind of an individual playing a particular role in American politics. So presidential systems tend to be focused on individuals anyhow. The problem with the presidency is that it's not just one person from one party, they're also head of state. So, like a king or queen, they have to represent all the American people. They have to represent them abroad and at home, but at the same time, they're also political figures. So, throughout American history, from George Washington onwards, it's always been this one person represents the nation, either morally, which might be stretching it nowadays, considering what most people think of politicians, but certainly politically. So this also is quite important internationally because we tend to, we might have disliked George W. Bush for invading a country. Then suddenly, Barack Obama comes along and we like America again. So it's quite a refreshing system in that way, internationally
Mm.
and domestically.
And I guess if we look at the this current campaign and maybe I don't know whether it just feels more divisive, the language of crooked Joe Biden and you know, so it feels perhaps more divided than ever, Lee. And you say that the president is often or historically, I remember the president being treated quite reverentially almost as a head of state. But do you see the kind of landscape changing where it's so it appears the two candidates are so much attacking each other's personalities. Almost how does that get brought back together once the final votes are counted?
It's almost impossible to bring the country together because the presidency is meant to be a unifying figure. It's the only figure in American politics in which the whole of America votes on. There's no other elected figure that does that. Either you're a governor or you're elected at the state level. So it does raise temperatures because the president holds quite a lot of power in the modern era, but it does make it very difficult to bring people together. Almost impossible, I would say. However, America has had similar time periods. I think from Franklin Roosevelt, Second World War, American politics became more bilateral. They would talk to each other. There was a sense that they were a united country, kind of saving the rest of the world from Soviet Union, from communism. So there were common themes. And they
Mm.
did throw insults at each other, in the 60s and 50s and so forth. Um, but looking at the 19th century, they were pretty vicious towards each other. So this is
So it's
that's almost a system that encourages insults, I think.
so is that the insulting language and the lack of respect for each other perhaps isn't as new as we think it is.
No, and before Trump came along, I would say, well, actually, it was worse in the 19th century, and what we're seeing is just a wobble. Since Trump came along, I think it has polarized more on both sides. But Thomas Jefferson was accused of things I can't say here, but and he accused John Adams of being a hermaphrodite, and it was all just mad politics in the 19th century. They would accuse him of all kinds of things,
Okay. And
even of being Catholic on occasion, because if you're Catholic, you can't be president.
didn't
So 19th
didn't
century was full of continuing insults. Lyndon Johnson, who's president after JFK, he was possibly one of the worst, and we got Nixon after him. LBJ would just accuse people of all kinds of things, being abusers of well, women or children, whatnot. And he goes, it doesn't matter if it's true, just get the person to deny it, And then people will think, well, there's no smoke without fire. So that was Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, 1960s. Um,
So fascinating then that what we, perhaps I naively saw as a new phenomenon, part of the digital age, I guess it sounds like it's been off and on for
yeah,
well over the last 120 odd years.
yeah. Americans have always enjoyed throwing insults at each other. I mean, they shoot each other. I mean, they assassinate. We
Yeah.
don't tend to assassinate prime ministers. It's almost like they're not worth it in this country. Whereas in America, they're always taking pot shots at them. You know, they've had
Well,
four presidents assassinated, and on the floor of the Senate, they used to attack each other. It's very excitable.
because funny enough, because kind of the closest to kind of anything kind of violent, I guess, any of our kind of head top, top politicians have done was back. I think if we cast in our minds back into the Blair years, when Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott lumped someone who basically chucked an egg at him.
Yeah.
But didn't one of the VPs, was it Burr? Didn't he shoot someone, or was that kind of a thing? Is
Aaron
that
Burr, yes. He shot Alexander Hamilton. Don't get me singing.
so? So he shot a
I
guy,
won't enjoy
and
it.
it spawned a musical.
No, I was
Not
going to say,
immediately.
I don't think the
Spoilers.
world is
Sorry.
ready for Pompey Politics, the musical. I think that's something
Maybe
we'll
not.
keep that
There's a
under wraps.
challenge.
So
But yes,
exactly.
anybody who's
I'm good.
seen the Hamilton musical, Aaron Burr tried to have a revolution against Jefferson, and then he goes out and shoots Hamilton because he'd been insulting him during the election. It's quite exciting. We don't tend to, well, we've got the Second Amendment in America, I guess. They do. And Donald Trump's had a few assassination attempts recently, so it's not that different, I don't think. But their
I'm going to
politics has
throw.
always been, as I said, the crack cocaine of proper politics. This is,
So
um,
have we been spoilt then over the last couple of decades, where actually we've been lulled into this
I
false
think so,
sense of
yeah.
security that actually it's quite calm and measured,
Yeah, so looking
and
back at
then we're alarmed by
Reagan,
this, and actually, okay, that's
even if you look at Nixon, who everybody thinks is the kind of the pantomime villain of, all politics in the 1970s, but certainly American politics. He's pretty foul-mouthed. He recorded everything, which actually was his downfall in the end. So we know exactly what he was saying. He was absolutely foul-mouthed and racist and homophobic and sexist, but in public, he still maintained that kind of decorum. So I think we've just lost that now. It's gone. Americans have lost that sense of respect, I think, for their institutions. Because the presidency used to be really respected. It was like 50, 60% of Americans used to like the presidency. That's not the case now. Biden's barely got over 40% approval rating the past 4 years. And Donald Trump barely got over 42, 45, something like that. So I think those days have gone for a while anyway.
okay. Interesting to look at it though through the lens of history, because we're looking at it now and thinking how dreadful and disastrous and risky and insightful. I'm trying to think of loads of different adjectives that the current situation is. But actually, if you look back on history, it's interesting to kind of look at it through that lens and understand that they've not all been as clean as can be. They've not all actually had
No,
that kind of perfect professional persona where. And maybe it's not to the kind of to the to the extremes or to the state that you got now. But I mean, funny, of all the things Donald Trump's done, he's not shot anyone. I mean, he
no, he
might
did
win
say
if
he
he
could stand
did,
in the middle
but
of Manhattan and shoot somebody, and his ratings would probably go up.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's
it
probably
would
quite true.
probably
It's probably
appeal
one
to
of
the
the
base.
trophies.
Yeah, that's one way to
If you look at
one way to.
American politics again in the 19th century, the 1876 election, that came
Mhm.
down to violence in Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina. It came down to those three states. Who won those three states was going to win the presidency. There was fighting. They thought there'd be a second civil war. So they've always cheated and had violence in American elections till quite recently. Um,
Okay.
Voting Rights Act of 1965, which kind of completes the kind of political civil rights movement of the 1960s, which gives African Americans
Hmm.
the right to vote and so forth, and the federal government can step in and help them if they're being stopped. So America becomes a proper democracy in 1965. That's only 65 till now. It's really the only kind of clean elections they've had, I would say. So even not fighting or shooting each other or cheating, putting extra ballot papers in the ballot box and so forth, that was pretty routine going up to the 20th century.
Okay, well, I think that kind of leads us nicely into our next question, which is the run up to the elections. It seems a long one. They seem to kind of get going. They have all their primary stuff a year before, and it seems just to go on forever. Is the American system now geared to elect more extreme candidates on both sides, or is there kind of any hope for a centre? I guess with their politics.
It's tricky with their political system, I think, because you only have two. Well, you've got other parties you can vote for, but they're not going to get in. So you can vote for Green or an independent or libertarian or the Prohibition Party to get rid of alcohol. That still exists in America. But they're not going to get in. It might let the other person get in because you've siphoned off votes to another, smaller party. We have this, in our constituencies in this country, so it's not unfamiliar to us, first past the post system. So that doesn't allow for a lot of kind of moderation. And most states in America, tend to vote one way now. I think about 20% of states now mix up who they vote for. So they might vote for a Republican for president, for a senator, they might vote for a Democrat, governor, they might vote for a Republican again. That hardly happens now. Um, Going back to the 1970s, it was 60, 70% of most states would kind of choose different candidates. They'd probably look at the candidates and prefer one over another for individual reasons or political reasons. But that doesn't tend to happen. It's much more polarized. So Texas is a good example. I don't think they voted statewide for a Democrat for this century, I don't think. How many, we've been in this century for 24 years, and in that state, they haven't voted for a Democrat for governor or for the Senate or for a statewide place. So in that way, each state is becoming more divided. Texas looks at California, which is a very blue state. It's kind of uber liberal. And they look at that as being the kind of California is, everything that's wrong with liberalism is happening in California. I mean, they do have Hollywood, so it's an easy kind of thing that the Republicans can pick on. At the same time, Democrats say everything that's going wrong in America is happening in red states like Florida. They might be reducing women's right to choose. They all have too many guns. So it's actually becoming much more polarized. And part of the problem of this is the first past the post system. You just need to get a plurality of the vote and winner takes all, basically. Part of the problem, of course, is that America is a federal system. So in this election, the presidential election, you're not having one election and whoever gets the most votes wins. You're having 50 different elections in 50 different states. They run their elections differently because the Constitution says you can run them differently, as long as they're run above board and they're not being racist or kicking people out and so forth from the voting booth. Um, and that creates a very polarized membership as well, which you can see, I think, perhaps in the Conservative Party at the moment. And when Labour are out for a long time, they voted for Corbyn, the membership tend to vote for political purity, perhaps.
Hmm.
Mm.
So when you're running for president, you're running for governor, you have to go through a primary first, you have to win the membership over. That's been going on since the beginning of the 20th century, but really digs in most states from 1968 onwards. So you need to win the membership over first of all, and you do that by talking about things they feel passionate about. What do liberals feel passionate about is different from what Republicans feel passionate about. So Republicans, to get their people out, who's the purist on gun control, no, not having gun control, who is purist on the right to life and all these kind of things, who's going to lower taxes the most, who's the most moral, all these kinds of issues. Trump is slightly odd. Perhaps come back to him on that. Whereas liberals will talk about perhaps the environment, women's right to choose. They'll talk about LGBT issues, perhaps. And those issues are opposites in both parties, so they feel differently about those issues. So once they've won the primaries, they then have to win a general election in their state, their governor, or in a presidential election on a national level. And that's very difficult to come back from. So how do you say you believe in a right to life and you don't believe a woman should choose, what she does with her body. And then in the general election, you've got to say, well, I might change my mind because you might lose your core membership who go out and knock on doors and send out leaflets. And so it's very difficult. And of course, those people always come out to vote, so you can't just abandon them.
Yeah, it's a very different thing, isn't it? Speaking to your party members
Yeah,
versus actually the voters at large, because most people aren't members of a political party. I think
no,
there are some people that say that there's always something a bit wrong with you if you're actually a member of a political party because
yeah,
you're committed to a degree to politics, um, in a level that most people just aren't. They're busy living their lives,
yeah,
but the membership of and that's an interesting point you make there, because the membership of the two major parties in the UK seem to be in slightly different places than what their target voters might well be in. And
yeah,
that seems to be an internal struggle that both of those parties, and it seemed to be more historically a Labour thing, but
yeah,
rather than a Conservative thing. Whereas this now, most recently, without us kind of delving into the Tories Got Talent contest, it that seems to be now a Conservative kind of thing. Is the membership are in a different place
yeah.
to where actually their voters at large. And to be fair, I think you see it in other parties too. You just don't. It's not as evident because they're not as large and front and
Yeah.
centre.
And you might have two people who don't agree with each other, generally in the same party, and they rip the party apart. They've got to put it back together again before the
Yeah,
election. It can be
yeah,
good in one way because you're getting a motivated
hmm
audience who's your membership. But in another way, it may completely destroy the party. And it's very difficult to win if you're too divided.
yeah.
And Democrats tend to be like Labour in this country, they quite often just argue amongst themselves. They'd rather be ideologically pure. Whereas now the Republicans, well, it's the party of Trump, let's be absolutely honest. Is it a conservative party? It's difficult to say now. But it's certainly the party of Trump. And he pretty much what he says goes for his party. So it's a very unified party, the Republican Party. However, it doesn't always attract those independent voters and might actually lose some independent-minded Republicans as well, who just think they've gone too far and how do we get rid of Trump? So I think that's what Kamala Harris is betting on, that Donald Trump has just put off too many of his own, liberal Republicans. I'm not sure they exist, but people like Liz Cheney and people like that who did vote to impeach Trump
So
in
yeah,
January 2021.
so the ones on their internal kind of diagram, they would be on the left of their party. So they're the ones kind of
Yeah,
closer to the centre.
yeah.
Yeah, okay, and
Well, they certainly
that
don't like what Trump's doing particularly, and they'd be accused of being establishment. So it's very understandable in America why they don't like their politicians, and you get a populist movement. I can really understand why they have that. I'm not sure Trump is the answer to that particularly, but Bernie Sanders, 2016, 2020, of the left, he calls himself a democratic socialist. In America, that's anathema. You don't call yourself a socialist. He got a lot of popularity in the Democratic Party against Hillary Clinton in particular, who was seen as an establishment party. I think America is desperate looking for new candidates, new parties. It's just the political system doesn't allow it.
Well, if we move to the political system, Lee, and I am delighted to have this question, the Electoral College system, can we just touch on that first? You mentioned there's kind of 50 individual elections, one in each state. So to eventually elect the president in broad terms, each state is a college. Can you give us the overview for idiots on the Electoral College system in America?
I shall do my best.
then we'll be
This is the
we'll be
thing my
this we'll be
students
the
love
only.
most when I talk about the Electoral College. It's a constitutional anachronism. It's created in the 1780s to ensure that the South will vote for the Constitution and they will become a United States of America because they were really worried the North would just get rid of slavery and the North was becoming industrialized and they'd impose their industrial system on the kind of rural South. I mean, very basically, it was North versus South at that time as it went into the Civil War in the 1860s. So they came up with this concept of the Electoral College. And so from 1789 up to this day, no American has ever voted for president because they don't vote for president. They vote. I know it already sounds mad. They actually vote for electoral candidates who then go on to vote for the president themselves. So you're not ever voting for a president. You're voting for somebody to go off and then vote for the president. And the reason they did that, because they thought, well, you might get a madman running who promises the earth in a democracy. Therefore, you need somebody stood in the way to go, no, you're not going to be president because you're going to become a dictator, or you're going to set up a kingship or something like that, a monarchy. So they deliberately put a wall between people voting and who gets elected. How they did this was to put it at the state level. So each state, and do jump in if this just sounds mad, because it could
Yeah,
be.
no,
No,
so
no,
just
we're keenly listening.
yeah,
Sorry, don't mind. Go
yeah,
for it.
no, and I was just going to say, so if my understanding is correct, then because we're talking about them contesting states, so for instance, you know, I think each state has kind of almost like a points value. So,
Yeah,
you know, when you win California, that gives you a number of folk
yeah,
who will go. I don't know the numbers, but let's say it's 10. I think my understanding is that if you win California, you get to send 10 good people and true for the final vote. But it's a winner takes all system, isn't it?
it
So
is. Yeah,
if California is Democrat, as it almost certainly will be,
yeah,
then however many people will all go and vote for the presidential nominee from the
yeah.
Democrats.
So the Electoral College, every state doesn't have equal weight. It depends on their population. So California has the biggest population, 50, 60 million people, has the fifth largest economy or the sixth largest economy in the world. It's a real powerhouse of kind of industry and finance and Hollywood. It has 54 electoral college votes. So
Right.
whoever wins California, and it's going to be the Democrats because it always is, they will put that 54 into the bigger pot from whatever the other states do. Texas, which is very likely to go red, it's another big state. I do have it here, about 40 electoral college votes. So there's 500, and I wrote this down because I knew I'd forget, 538 electoral college votes. So you need 270 to win. So you're not totaling up the popular vote, you're totaling up the electoral college from each state. So Alaska, which it has a small population, about 500,000 people, even though it's the biggest state in the union, only has 3 electoral college votes.
Wow. So that gives an idea of scale, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, probably not many people going to campaign in Alaska. And just for interest, is it a physical vote? Are there three people sent from Alaska to raise their hands, or is it all done?
This is archaic. So however they vote in Alaska for those 3 people, um, they are put forward, 3 for the Democrats, 3 for the Republicans. They are decided by the party. It's usually the party faithful. They just like doing it. They have to go to the capital of Alaska. Why did I choose Alaska? I can't remember what it is. Is it Anchorage? I've forgotten now. They have to go to the capital and then they have to vote by telling the lieutenant governor or lieutenant governor, as they say in America, and the governor how the state has voted. And they do that in mid-December. Each state can do that, but it has to be done by, and again, I wrote this down, December the 11th. So each state needs their state electors to go to the capital to literally vote in the Electoral College.
And has there ever been an example? My wife, who also happens to be Simon's sister, asked me this question when we were talking about it in the week. Has there ever been anybody who's turned up and voted the, the other way,
They have,
to the way that they've been instructed?
yes, they're not allowed to now. It's illegal. You have to vote the way your state has told you to go. Otherwise, you have a jail sentence. So you can do it, but you're going to go to jail.
Right.
They generally don't do it, but in the past they have done this. It might just
Perfect.
be 1 or 2, but it's not always. Sometimes it might be the whole lot of them, but that hasn't happened for an awful long time. It's usually just 1 or 2 that do it, and it's
Perfect.
not a big deal. But again,
So
the reason for that is to stop a lunatic becoming president. apparently.
Well, that opens up a whole other
How's that
slew of
The
going for
system
them?
questions.
doesn't work
Um,
anyway, so
so so so I'm just trying to translate this into. And you're doing a great job of explaining this for us, but I'm just trying to dumb it down even further for our listeners who are keen observers of UK politics. So in the UK Parliament system, obviously our head of state isn't an elected head of state. So kind of putting aside the presidential kind of thing for a second, we've got two houses in the House of Commons. We've got the House of Lords, and we've got the House of Commons. Sorry, in Parliament we've got two houses.
yeah.
In the US system, in Congress they've got two
We have,
houses.
yeah, they've got two chambers as well. The House of Representatives, which
Hmm.
is the democratic body, which is reflective of population. So again, California has 52 um, congressmen or congresspeople, whereas Alaska would just have one because you have to have a minimum of one.
Yeah.
And they
Okay.
represent constituencies in their state. So it's very much like the House of Commons here. Each state has constituencies,
Yeah.
which then sends people to Congress from either party. Um,
Okay. So like ours, one of the parliamentary reviews recently was to try to bring back into, because obviously demographics changes over time.
yeah,
One of the recent parliamentary constituency reviews in the UK was about trying to align kind of the number of voters in a constituency
yeah,
to a kind of a more kind of average kind of level.
yeah,
And is that kind of, and is it districts they call them? Is that
yeah,
yeah?
districts.
So
Yeah.
the translation for constituency is district. Sorry, I'm just trying to think of literally American
Every
to
10
English.
years, yeah, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. Every 10 years, America has a census. It's in the
Yeah.
Constitution, so they have to do it.
Hmm.
And they find out how people have moved across the United States, which states lose population, which gain them. For the first time in California's history, they've lost one delegate because the population has moved to places like Texas or New Mexico or Florida. So they do that every 10 years. So it's quite possible if everybody suddenly moves out of California, they'll end up with hardly
It
anything
loses its
anyway.
power to be
Yeah,
a king, for want of a
yeah.
better word, a kingmaker in the.
It does. So
Yeah.
it tends to have geographical political shifts over time. So 19th century, it's north industrial versus south rural. Then it
Mm-hmm.
became the 20th century with the Rust Belt, Michigan,
Hmm.
Illinois, Chicago, all those kinds of places. Then getting into the 20th century, it suddenly shifted to the West Coast, which is, Reagan was from California, so was Nixon. Tend to forget that, California hasn't always been that liberal. So it does tend to have that geographical shift, which means there's different interests that they have. California has very different interests, say, to Nebraska or Hawaii. So over time, the politics changes to reflect where the population goes.
That's a perfect lead into my next question because we hear a lot of talk about swing
Yeah,
states, and it looks like to an outsider, like about 40 of the states are kind of everyone just seems to be shrugging and sorting them into red, blue, um, and then focusing on the sort of swing states as the real battleground.
yeah.
Is that something in America that is there a discussion about that? Is there any kind of talk of voting reform? Obviously, a lot of talk in the UK about proportional representation versus first past the post. But I guess there are some ultra blue and ultra red states where almost it might feel like a waste of time voting on Tuesday if
Yeah.
you're part of the other team.
I think there's probably places that Kamala Harris hasn't visited because what would be the point? Because Wyoming is going to vote red, it's going to vote for the Republicans. It would be a major earthquake if they didn't. North, South Dakota, the Dakotas, probably no Democrat goes there particularly. Whereas Texas is slightly light red now, so it's worth going there if you're, blue or Democrat, because one day it might flip. Um, Florida, which is quite reliably Republican, but it could flip. It's only two, three, 4 percentage points, so it might be worth visiting. But you're absolutely right. Most of the states hardly worth going to because they're going to vote Democrat, they're going to vote Republican, they're going to vote, between 4 and 10 points at least for those particular parties. So you have swing states which might be quite small states sometimes. So California never sways an election because it always goes Democrat. It's always there. You visit it because Kamala Harris is from California. She's going to go home occasionally, but she has to try to build up a coalition of other states to get to 270 electoral college votes. So she will win places like Washington State, Oregon. She'll win the West Coast. She'll win most of the Northeast, which is liberal and Democratic. Virginia, some of those Midwest states, but she'll still be slightly short of 270. Whereas Trump will win probably Texas, Montana, probably win Florida, a lot of those states. So between them, they'll have like 205, 210 electoral college votes each. And then they're fighting over that last 60, basically.
So these 435 representatives that are
Yeah.
being formed to the House of Representatives, how long are their terms for? Because
Only
the
2
UK it's
years.
like 2 years.
It's utterly
So
insane. 2 years. It's the most democratic system in one way, but they're always running for re-election
well, yeah,
because they
you
won't be
must
stopped.
constantly be in campaign mode, like Portsmouth City Council, I
America
guess.
is constantly in campaign mode. The whole lot of them, 435, are up for re-election every 2 years. So 2 years ago, we had midterms. I say we, it's nothing to do with me. They had
You just get to
midterms.
observe. You don't have to. You don't have to go through it
Get to the
yourself.
point,
But
go just straight
yeah,
on. So all 435 of them, we call it midterms because it's not the presidency. And then from that, we think, oh, how are they going to vote in the next 2 years? But all of them are constantly running for re-election. It's in the Constitution. To get a constitutional amendment to change that would be really difficult, which is why
so
why they have kept the Electoral College and all
well,
the other
yeah.
states
I
and
guess I guess it's kind of really difficult. So that's kind of one side of the House. The other side of the House, that's the Senate.
Senate, yeah.
Yeah, and there's 100 senators.
Just 100 of them because each state gets two senators. So it doesn't matter how small they are or how large they are, they always get two senators who are voted by the whole state.
Right.
Get two senators. There's 100 of them. It's more kind of they're elected for 6 years, so it's a bit more collegiate. They don't usually shout at each other too much. They're polite to each other, at least in the
So
Senate.
they're a bit more like the House of Lords then, except that
Yeah,
they're elected.
that was the kind of point. They don't
But
have to
but
keep getting for re-election, so they'd be more thoughtful. They have more power over foreign policy,
right.
over who sits on the Supreme Court and the federal courts. So they're seen as more gentlemanly. That's how they like to see themselves. But that means states that hardly have any population, going back to Alaska, they've got 500,000 people, they get two senators. California, 40, 50 million, they get two senators. So very much like the Electoral College, they all have equal votes in the Senate. California might want a very liberal law, but they're never going to get it because those small states, of which there's a lot of them, we call them the cut and paste states because they're like squares and they just keep putting them across. They just kind of gang up, and that was the whole point of the federal system, was to stop anything happening. So the system kind of works because if you want something done, you're meant to do it at the state level. Article 10 of the Constitution, which is the one everybody ignores, including the Republicans, says if it's not in the Constitution, leave it to the states. However, gay marriage, Obamacare, healthcare, these kind of things aren't mentioned in the Constitution. Are they things that should be done at a national level because times have changed since 1780? Or should we leave it to the states? They're still arguing over these arcane kind of rules.
Yeah, because just to kind of dial, because that bit you put, because the number of votes and the number of representatives that they get, and their contribution to the Electoral College is based on the number of voters that there are, or the number of people that there are. Sorry, in that state when the census is done. But does that count everybody? Is it literally every person, or are
It's
some
meant to
people
count
not
absolutely everybody. So it's whoever not just votes, but whoever is
all
participating.
of the yeah?
Because they also have to, pay for schools, that kind of thing. So they like to know where everybody is. So very much as we use the census in this country of, where do resources need to go. And it is based on there's no representation with no taxation. I always get this the wrong way. No taxation without representation, which is the basis of the American Revolution, really. So
Well,
if
yeah,
you're a
that's
taxpayer, you should be counted.
You should have the ability to
Yeah,
elect the people, appoint the people that decide how much taxes you get to
yeah.
pay. Otherwise, you get to
You
throw
should,
some tea in a harbour.
exactly. So you shouldn't want to throw tea in the harbour because you have your say and it's based on population. And if you have a bigger population, you're paying more tax. The problem with that is the Constitution, when it was originally written, called African Americans or Black Americans, well, it didn't call them that for a start, but it called them three-fifths of a person. So for tax purposes, the South was taxed for each slave they had, each five slaves represented three people. Therefore, the South had more representation in the House of Representatives, even though African Americans couldn't vote. So that was in the Constitution. Black people were three-fifths of a person. That's no longer the case, but that was the original Constitution, that the North
Right.
wouldn't have
Okay.
too much power because
Yeah.
people tended to live in cities, so they'd have more power. The South was more rural, they had less population. So in the South, they said, I'll tell you what we'll do, we'll count African Americans, even though they can't vote, they're not citizens. Therefore, we'll have more power in the House of Representatives. It's
But
a
they got rid
crooked
of that, right?
system. They've got rid of that
Wow.
since 1965.
But
No,
it took
since
them that long to
14th
get rid of it.
Amendment,
All
the
right.
13th Amendment when they got rid of slavery. Didn't
Right.
mean African
Okay.
Americans could vote, but
Right.
progress is slow apparently.
Yeah. Crikey. Where did we get to, Ian?
Question
No idea.
five.
Sorry about that.
Question
No, no,
five.
no. This is the stuff. This is gold dust. This is what we were after. So question 5. So the 2020 results were hotly contested by some people, despite there being no evidence of the wrongdoing. I'm sure they would say otherwise. So what happens if? Because this is the other thing: is in our system, the result is declared overnight, right? And literally the next guys come into office, unless there's some talk about a coalition,
Yeah.
unless it's a really tight thing, come into office kind of the next day. The American system, they don't come into office until January.
Yeah.
But
It's a brutal system in this country. You're out the
yeah,
door immediately.
it's like literally
I quite like that.
literally poor Rishi being homeless like that after
Oh,
standing in the
no,
rain.
terrible. You have to move
Um,
to
but you're right, Ian. So
Sorry.
so but what happens if we have a similar situation? So say Trump wins the popular vote, but Harris wins the Electoral College. Are we going to have a same situation again? Could Trump challenge that?
Yes, I mean anybody can challenge results in any particular state. It's all set up to do that. It's absolutely legitimate to do that. If it's below one side wins by, I think well, it depends which state, but it's about 0.5 of a percentage. You just get a recount anyway. But if you've lost, you can say, well, I want a recount and I want it done by electronically or I want it done by hand. So it can go on several days. And then they're calling all their lawyers as well. I mean, this is just party time for lawyers. And you can call all lawyers in. They will look at each ballot to make sure it is, absolutely intended to vote a particular way. It can take 2 or 3 weeks as long as it's all done by December the 11th. They can keep contesting stuff. They can go to the state courts. They can go to the federal courts. They can go to the Supreme Court if they want. But this is certainly what Trump did in 2020, and the federal courts and the state courts threw it out saying you've shown no evidence whatsoever. I think it was about 60 cases. Even quite conservative judges, because they're all appointed on political merit, they threw out a lot of Trump's cases saying, well, you haven't presented any evidence at all. But that wasn't the point of what Trump was doing. He was laying in distrust of the system. So about 30 or 40% of Republicans believe the last election was rigged and Biden stole it. There's no evidence whatsoever for this. However, the legal system allows their people to make absolutely sure there's been no kind of criminal activity, so they can go to the courts, all this kind of stuff. But by December 11th, they have to have got it all sorted, which means the governor of each particular state needs to sort it. But it might be you're a Republican governor and you've been elected recently by MAGA, and you might decide to overturn what the electorate said. In that case, it might have to go to the Supreme Court, which is what happened in 2000. Democrats and Republicans all came down to Florida, and the Democrats
Hmm.
and Republicans took it all the way to the Supreme Court because they couldn't decide. Um, and the Supreme Court said there's nothing wrong with how Florida was counting the vote, so they just left them to it.
I
So
think I
what the Supreme Court did was to say stop counting. So it doesn't sound very democratic. They just stopped counting. You've already declared the result. You can go back to that and say George W. Bush won. The problem with that was the governor of Florida at the time was his Jeb Bush, who was the brother of George W. Bush. So even if it was legal, it didn't look particularly edifying, I don't think.
if I remember that, wasn't that something to do with an automated voting machine in
Oh,
Orange County, or
yes, no,
have I had a fever dream, or was
no,
that
no,
part
no.
of it?
I'll say hanging chads that might bring back nightmares.
Yeah,
Like you punch a hole in, but actually, was it hanging out? Did he punch the hole straight through? And this is where you have the lawyers looking with magnifying glasses to see where the hole punch went through. Was it for the Democrat, or did that go accidentally to the Green candidate? And they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they said, no, you can stop the count because there's nothing wrong with it. And the Supreme Court, that wasn't the Electoral College, that was the Supreme Court handed the presidency to the Republicans.
So
so we've spoken about looking closely, Lee. Now is your chance to glance into your crystal ball.
Oh, Lord.
Who do you who do you think is going to win,
This is the
and
question I get
why?
all the time. I explain all these kind of intricacies. I go, but who's going to win?
Well, I think
Um,
that the challenge is, Lee, isn't it? Is that it is a complex
yeah,
system, and I think we kind of you know we only get the edited highlights over here in
yeah,
the UK, and and as we watch from afar with our popcorn, everyone wants to fast forward to the end,
yeah,
and who's going to win it this time? So go on, we'll
yeah.
put you on the spot.
will
That's
anyone
absolutely
thinking of
fine.
staying
I'm
up?
prepared for this, don't worry. And to hedge my bets as well. 2020, it did take about a week or 4 or 5
Oh,
days to get to counting all the votes.
I
So,
really.
it's not done exactly the same
So,
day.
so anyone kind of thinking of staying up Tuesday night waiting for a result is going to be sadly disappointed.
And you're also 5 or 6 hours behind, so what's the point? Get up at
Yeah,
1 or 2 in the morning if you're that obsessed. I
you've
am,
got.
so
Yeah.
I'll be doing that. I do that for British elections as well. And it can go either way because those. So I'm going to put forward it could go either way. I'm going to put that forward first. Pennsylvania, this is like between 1 or 2 points. It could go either way, particularly.
Mhm.
Don't worry, I'm going to put forward what I think is going to happen,
Yeah,
No,
so
yeah.
don't
I
worry.
so I can be embarrassed. Um, but it could go either way. So the Electoral College could be a landslide for Donald Trump, or it could be a landslide for Kamala Harris. We don't particularly know. However, because I know people like this stuff and they like to embarrass me later, I think um, the Rust Belt is swaying towards Kamala Harris at the moment, and I'll come back to why I think this is the case. If Donald Trump wins, it's because of immigration, which has been quite staggering quite recently. What was it, 11 million people crossing the border? I mean, it's quite staggering. What Donald Trump says about it is unedifying, but or it will be the economy because inflation's been bad. So, if he wins, it will be for those reasons. And I'll come back to why I think Kamala Harris will win. I think she'll win Wisconsin. It looks like that's going her way at the moment. It's like 2, 3, 4 points. Michigan looks like it will probably go towards. I'm actually clicking this on my laptop, so it's coming up with all the. I can give you my electoral college things. Pennsylvania, I think, is too close to say, but those three states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, tend to vote the same way and have done since about 1992. I'm loving this. This is like I'm on the BBC now or CNN.
Yeah, yeah, no, this is great.
You are our. Is it? No, it's not. I nearly said Richard
So
Curtis. It's not Richard. He's the guy that does the films, isn't he?
he is. It
Yep.
was, yes, that was the Christmas, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Professor Curtis, John Curtis,
Yes.
from
Yeah.
Sheffield
That's it. John
University
Curtis.
or
Yeah.
wherever it was. Yeah. So
Thinking of Love
I'll put those
Actually.
three in her, which isn't unreasonable because they went for Biden last time. Time before that, they went for Trump. I think Nevada will probably go red. I think that's going to be Republican. I think Arizona, even though Arizona does have a referendum, I never know which, statewide about women's right to choose, and they do have some weird candidates on the Republican side, who's not just MAGA, but MAGA. So I think Arizona, I think will go red. Georgia, I'm going to put in the red column because it's just too close. That is mad. That's coming down to about, that could be 10,000 votes, almost impossible to tell. I'm going to go rogue now and say North Carolina because nobody else is saying this. I think North Carolina is going to go blue. I've been saying this for 3 or 4 elections and it hasn't. So that would be 290 Electoral College votes to Kamala Harris, 248 to Republicans. But I mean, that's very close. That is a close election.
And if you're wrong about North Carolina, what does that
If
make
I
the
put that
final
back in the red
score?
column, 274 to Kamala Harris. She just needs to win the 3 Rust Belt states, which are Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. If she wins those, she's won. But that doesn't mean she might lose somewhere else. You often get a kind of rogue state that suddenly comes up with something weird. But if he wins, Trump wins Pennsylvania, which is perfectly possible. He wins by 283 Electoral College votes. But I'm putting myself out there. I'm thinking Kamala Harris will just win 283 Electoral College votes. Quote me,
Well,
embarrass me. I really don't mind. I think she'll win because of the gender gap.
We've got it recorded for posterity.
Yes, embarrassing.
Yeah, I think for most of us mere mortals, it all looks too close to call, and those of us that perhaps aren't enamoured with the behaviour of Trump, kind of, again, leaving politics aside, kind of can't believe it's going to be that close.
No,
but
no.
I guess history, as we've learned this evening, can show us that it's always been a bit this way.
It has. It's always been quite close and goes off in different directions. And this always throws up surprises, 2016 being one of them. If the Republicans hadn't run Trump, if they put Nikki Haley, governor of South Carolina, she comes across as very rational. You may disagree with her politics, but she's more old school Republican. I think she'd have won. I think she'd have won in a reasonable landslide. But Republicans are they're enamored by Donald Trump for some reason. And they didn't win the midterms particularly. And it was the female vote came out and they voted against the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which was a woman's right to choose. That was overturned by the Supreme Court in 2022. So I think women will come out, and white women who tend to vote for the Republican Party by about 52%, if they swing behind Kamala Harris, at least for the presidency, they might vote Republican, as we say, further down the ticket. Then Kamala Harris will win in, not a landslide, but she'll win in quite a convincing way. Donald Trump has upset a lot of women. Let's put it that way.
Well,
that's I mean that's almost not news, is it?
No.
Well, I guess if we're looking for a final thought for the podcast, then perhaps Donald Trump has upset quite a lot of women. Could well be the tip.
That's the soundbite
to where that takes.
He has upset a lot of people, and they've taken him to court, and he is a sex offender. But he's the first ex-president to now have all these court cases. He's a felon basically, but he might still win, and he could be a felon in the White House or in jail because there's nothing stopping him from running the country from Sing Sing prison or something. Wow. I don't think that's still running, but
No. I think on that bombshell we'll close. Lisa, thank you ever so much for coming along this evening. You've been listening to the Pompey Politics podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris. And our guest this evening has been Lee Sartain. Thank you very much, Lee.
Thank you very much.
And I've been Simon Sansbury. Join us next week at 6:27. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, comment, etc., etc. Do share your opinions, and do have a look at our website if you'd like to sign up for our emails, just to get some advanced notifications of our shows. But we'll see you next week at 6:27. Thanks very much. Don't forget to like, follow and comment on Facebook, or comment and subscribe on YouTube. Find us on all the social media platforms: Facebook, X, YouTube, Threads, LinkedIn.